The camera pans over a pristine, manicured lawn, then settles on a group of laughing, splashing people in an inflatable pool. A hand grips a sprinkler valve, knuckles white. The sound of the party is abruptly cut by the sharp, rhythmic hiss of sprinklers. Chaos erupts. A woman's scream pierces the air as the camera zooms in on a face contorted in rage, water plastering hair to her cheeks. "You will regret this," she snarls, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the rising water. The first sign of trouble was the flamingo, a gaudy pink plastic thing perched on the perfectly manicured lawn that separated Ilara's property from her neighbors. It was an eyesore, a beacon of bad taste in a neighborhood that prided itself on understated elegance. Ilara had tried to ignore it, had even managed a tight-lipped smile when Karen, her neighbor, had waved at her from across the lawn, a smug grin plastered on her face. But the flamingo was just the beginning. The next day, a massive, inflatable pool appeared, a garish blue monstrosity that took up a significant portion of Karen's yard and, to Ilara's horror, encroached on her own. The property line was clearly marked, a discreet row of stones that had been there for as long as Ilara had owned the house. The pool was a clear violation, a blatant disregard for the unspoken rules of their community. Ilara was not a confrontational person. She preferred quiet mornings with a cup of tea and a good book, the gentle hum of her garden sprinklers the only sound to break the silence. But this was a declaration of war. She marched over to Karen's house, her heart pounding in her chest, a carefully rehearsed speech on her lips. "Karen," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Your pool seems to be on my property." Karen, a woman who seemed to be perpetually clad in brightly colored caftans, emerged from her house, a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. She looked at Ilara, then at the pool, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. "Oh, that? Don't be silly, darling. There's plenty of room for everyone." "That's not the point," Ilara insisted, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "The property line is clearly marked. You're trespassing." Karen's smile faltered, replaced by a look of disdain. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little bit of plastic. Besides, I'm having a party tomorrow. You should come. It'll be fun." The invitation was a dismissal, a clear indication that Karen had no intention of moving the pool. Ilara stood there for a moment, stunned into silence, as Karen turned and walked back into her house, the caftan billowing behind her like a triumphant flag. The party started early the next day. The music was loud, a thumping bass that vibrated through Ilara's walls and rattled her windows. The guests were even louder, their laughter and shrieks echoing through the neighborhood. Ilara tried to ignore it, tried to lose herself in her book, but the noise was relentless. She watched from her window as Karen's guests, a boisterous crowd of people who looked as out of place in their quiet neighborhood as the plastic flamingo, splashed and played in the pool. They were loud, they were obnoxious, and they were on her property. Something inside Ilara snapped. The quiet, reserved woman who had always avoided conflict was gone, replaced by a seething ball of rage. She thought of her garden, her sanctuary, now trampled and desecrated by a horde of strangers. She thought of her peace, shattered by the incessant noise. And she thought of Karen, with her smug smile and her blatant disregard for her neighbors. She walked to the side of her house, to the sprinkler valve that controlled the flow of water to her meticulously maintained lawn. Her hand hovered over the handle, her mind racing. This was crazy. This was something a teenager would do, not a grown woman. But the anger, the righteous indignation was too strong to ignore. With a deep breath, she turned the valve. The effect was instantaneous. The sprinklers, powerful and strategically placed, erupted from the ground, sending arcs of water cascading over the lawn. The partygoers, caught completely by surprise, shrieked as the cold water rained down on them. The music was drowned out, By the sound of the sprinklers, a steady, rhythmic hiss that seemed to mock their outrage. Karen, who had been lounging on a float in the middle of the pool, was drenched. She sputtered and flailed, her caftan clinging to her like a second skin. Her face, when she finally emerged from the water, was a mask of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the sprinklers. Ilara, who had been watching from her window, stepped out onto her porch, a serene smile on her face. "I'm just watering my lawn," she said, her voice calm and even. "It's a bit of a hot day, isn't it?" The party was over. The guests, soaked and furious, scrambled to gather their belongings, their angry shouts and curses lost in the steady downpour. The inflatable pool, now overflowing with water, sagged and buckled, the garish blue plastic a sad, deflated mess. Karen stood in the middle of the chaos, her eyes locked on Ilara. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You will regret this," she snarled, her voice a low, menacing promise. Ilara simply smiled. "I don't think I will," she said, and for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of peace. The sprinklers continued to run, a cleansing. Rain that washed away the remnants of the party, and with it, the last of Ilara's patience. The war had just begun, and Ilara, to her own surprise, was ready for it. The next morning, the silence was beautiful. Ilara sat on her porch, sipping her tea, the air fresh and clean after the previous day's dousing. The deflated husk of the blue pool lay like a beached whale on the property line, a testament to her victory. The gaudy flamingo had been knocked over and lay half-submerged in a puddle. A profound sense of satisfaction warmed her, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing. It wasn't just peace, it was justice. Her satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Around mid-morning, a van pulled up to Karen's house. Two men emerged and began unloading a series of long, metallic objects. Ilara watched with a growing sense of dread as they began to assemble them. They were wind chimes, but not the delicate tinkling kind. These were monstrous things, crafted from thick, industrial-looking pipes of varying lengths, some as long as a man's arm. They were hung from the low-hanging branches of the large oak tree that straddled the property line, its boughs reaching far into Ilara's yard. By noon, the installation was complete. A dozen of the metallic monstrosities dangled. Just feet from Ilara's garden, a phalanx of silent soldiers waiting for their command. It came with the afternoon breeze. It wasn't a chime. It was a clang. A deep, discordant, metallic bonging that seemed to vibrate in Ilara's very bones. It was the sound of a buoy in a storm, of a factory at closing time, of a dozen hammers falling on anvils at random intervals. It was chaos in auditory form. Reading in her garden was impossible. The noise was too jarring, too unpredictable. Even inside her house, with the windows closed, the low, resonant clanging penetrated the walls, a constant, maddening reminder of the woman next door. Karen was in her yard, of course, lounging on a newly delivered patio set, a triumphant smirk on her face. She raised her glass of iced tea to Ilara in a mock toast. Ilara knew confronting her would be useless. Karen would feign innocence, claiming a love for melodic art. Complaining to the HOA would be a bureaucratic nightmare, likely ending in a stalemate over what constituted a nuisance. No. This required a different approach. Karen wanted to play dirty, to use the pretense of acceptable neighborhood behavior to wage her war. Ilara would have to do the same. That evening, she went online. Her search history, usually filled with gardening tips and book reviews, now featured terms like high-powered bird feeders, best seed for attracting grackles, and legalities of flock attraction. An idea, audacious and brilliant, began to form. Karen wanted to assault her senses with noise. Ilara would fight back with nature. The packages began arriving 2 days later. A towering, multi-tiered bird feeding station, almost sculptural in its complexity. A solar-powered bird bath with a recirculating fountain. And bags upon bags of the highest quality, most irresistible birdseed money could buy. Black oil sunflower seeds, safflower, cracked corn, and sweet cakes. She spent the entire afternoon setting it up right in the center of her back lawn in full view of Karen's patio and directly under the accursed wind chimes. It was a declaration, a monument to her defiance. The first visitors arrived within the hour. A few curious sparrows, a bold blue jay. By the next morning, it was a convention. The air was filled with the chirps, squawks, and songs of dozens of birds. But Alara wasn't just aiming for songbirds. She had done her research. The cracked corn and sweet cakes were a siren call to the neighborhood's less refined avian residents. Soon, the grackles arrived, their iridescent black feathers shimmering. In the sun, their voices a series of loud, grating calls that completely overshadowed the clanging of the chimes. Then came the starlings, chattering and squabbling, and finally, the pigeons, cooing and strutting, descending in a great, flapping horde. Alara's yard was transformed into a bustling, chaotic, and very loud aviary. The noise was constant, a symphony of nature's most boisterous performers. And with the birds came their consequences. Karen's new patio furniture, a pristine white wicker set, was soon decorated with a Jackson Pollock-esque splatter of bird droppings. Her perfectly swept patio became a minefield of discarded seeds and feathers. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a constant pinched scowl. The inevitable confrontation came on the third day of the bird-pocalypse. Karen stormed across the lawn, her face a thundercloud of rage. "What is the meaning of this, Alara?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the cloud of birds. "My yard is a sewer! It's disgusting!" Alara looked up from her book, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. She had set up her favorite armchair in the garden, finding that the cacophony of birdsong was surprisingly effective at drowning out the metallic bonging. "I've taken up a new hobby," she said, her voice the epitome of calm. "Bird-watching. It's so relaxing. Isn't nature just wonderful, Karen?" "Relaxing?" Karen's voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "It's a plague! You have to get rid of them!" "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that," Alara said, with a gentle shake of her head. "They're God's creatures. Besides, I think the HOA has rules about interfering with local wildlife." She had checked. They didn't. But Karen didn't need to know that. Karen stood there, sputtering, completely outmaneuvered. She had been beaten at her own game of passive aggression. The rage in her eyes was terrifying. It was the impotent fury of a bully who had finally met their match. She spun on her heel, stomping back towards her yard, muttering threats under her breath. Alara watched her go, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. She felt a surge of power, a thrill that was both exhilarating and slightly frightening. She had discovered a part of herself she never knew existed. But her victory was fleeting. Karen, in her blind rage, did something impulsive. She grabbed her garden hose, twisted the nozzle to a high-pressure jet, and aimed it directly at the bird-feeding station. "Let's see your precious birds eat now," she screamed. The powerful stream of water slammed into the feeder, sending seeds flying and scattering the birds in a panicked flurry. But the structure was well made and deeply anchored. It shuddered but held firm. Frustrated, Karen wrestled with the writhing hose, losing her grip for a split second. The hose whipped around wildly, the jet of water cutting a destructive path. It sliced through Alara's prize-winning hybrid tea roses, the ones she had spent years cultivating, the ones that had won her a blue ribbon at the county fair. Petals were shredded, delicate stems snapped in two. The vibrant reds and pinks of the blossoms were torn away, leaving only mangled green stalks. The world seemed to go silent. The birds disappeared. The wind died down and the chimes fell quiet. All Ilara could see were her ruined roses, their decapitated stems bleeding water and chlorophyll onto the grass. The war was no longer about noise or property lines. It was no longer a game. Karen had just destroyed the one thing Ilara truly loved. Ilara stood up, her teacup rattling in its saucer as she set it down. The calm, serene smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hard mask. The thrill of the fight vanished, leaving behind a chilling, focused anger. This was no longer about winning, this was about retribution. Ilara did not sleep that night. She sat in her darkened living room, staring out at the mangled silhouettes of her roses. The cold anger that had settled in her chest was a heavy, solid thing. It wasn't the fleeting, hot rage of the sprinkler incident. This was different. This was a calculated coldness, a clarity of purpose she had never experienced before. Karen had escalated the war from a battle over territory and peace to an assault on something personal, something irreplaceable. She had drawn first blood, and Ilara now understood that to win, she couldn't just retaliate. She had to annihilate. The next morning, she dismantled the bird feeder. She swept her lawn clean of seeds and feathers. She pruned the ruined rose bushes down to mere stumps, a painful but necessary act. From Karen's perspective, it must have looked like a surrender. Ilara could feel her neighbor's smug gaze from across the lawn, could almost hear the triumphant thoughts. "I've broken her," Karen would be thinking. "The little mouse has finally learned her place. Let her think that." A predator always prefers its prey to be complacent. Ilara's new battlefield was her study. Her laptop, once a portal to literary worlds and gardening forums, was now a weapon of strategic research. She began to dig into Karen's life, not with idle curiosity, but with the focus of a detective hunting for a weakness. She scrolled through Karen's social media, a carefully curated gallery of superficial triumphs, charity luncheons, gaudy jewelry, and photos from her garden. The garden was a recurring theme. Karen wasn't just a casual gardener. She was the president of the Oakshade Neighborhood Garden Club. A new search query popped into Ilara's mind. Oakshade Garden of the Year competition. The results were illuminating. It was the neighborhood's premier event, a source of fierce competition and, for the winner, unparalleled bragging rights. The grand prize was a feature in Suburban Living, the glossy local magazine that every resident pretended not to read but secretly coveted being in. The reigning champion for the past 2 years, Karen Ilara had found it. The heart of Karen's pride, the source of her social standing. It was her garden, not the tacky, flamingo-adorned front lawn, but the meticulously landscaped backyard, a space Karen guarded with the ferocity of a dragon hoarding gold. To attack the garden was to attack Karen's very identity. But how? Weeds? Pests? Too common, too easily traced. Ilara needed something more elegant, more devastating. Something that once started could not be stopped. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in terms like invasive species, unstoppable plants, botanical nightmares. And then she found it. Falopia japonica. Japanese knotweed. The descriptions were terrifyingly poetic. The plant that can grow through concrete. A single rhizome fragment the size of a fingernail can generate an entire colony. Roots that can extend 20 feet and compromise housing foundations. Nearly impossible to eradicate, requiring years of costly chemical treatment. It was the perfect weapon. A silent, creeping botanical cancer. Acquiring it was surprisingly easy. A specialty nursery in another state, operating in a legal gray area, sold live rhizome fragments for research purposes. She paid in cash using a prepaid debit card and had it shipped to a P.O. box she opened for the occasion. The package that arrived a week later was small and unassuming. Inside, nestled in damp paper towels, was a piece of root that looked like a gnarled, dead twig. It felt impossibly light, yet held the potential for absolute destruction. The night she chose was moonless and damp, the air thick with the smell of rain. Dressed in dark clothing, gloves on her hands, Ilara slipped out of her back door. The world was asleep. Even the discordant wind chimes were silent, the air still and heavy. She moved like a ghost along the shadow of the property line fence, her heart a steady, cold drum in her chest. She knew exactly where to go. Karen's prize-winning azaleas were planted in a raised bed against the back of her house, near the corner where the patio met the wall. It was a spot Karen fussed over constantly, but her attention was always on the blooms, not the soil beneath. With a small trowel, Ilara carefully dug a shallow hole, hidden from view by the dense foliage of the azaleas. She dropped the gnarled rhizome fragment into the damp earth. It looked pathetic, harmless. She covered it back up, smoothing the soil and mulch, leaving no trace of her visit. The entire operation took less than 2 minutes, as she crept back. To her own yard, a profound sense of finality washed over her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. This was no longer a petty squabble. She had planted a seed of chaos, a slow-motion bomb that would, in time, tear down Karen's perfect world from the foundation up. The following weeks were a masterclass in deception. Ilara projected an aura of defeat. She kept to herself, her garden looking neglected, the stumps of her roses a constant visible reminder of her loss. Karen, emboldened by her perceived victory, became insufferable. She hosted afternoon teas on her patio, her voice carrying across the lawn as she recounted the tale of her troublesome neighbor to her friends, painting Ilara as a neurotic recluse who had finally been put in her place. Ilara ignored it all. She waited. She watched. The day of the Garden of the Year prejudging brunch arrived. It was a perfect late spring morning. Karen's garden was in full, glorious bloom. Ilara watched from her kitchen window as Karen led the 2 judges, a pair of stern-looking women with clipboards, through her floral kingdom. Karen was beaming, gesturing grandly at her hydrangeas, her voice dripping with self-congratulation. They rounded the corner to the azalea bed, Karen's pièce de résistance. Then, one of the judges, a woman named Mrs. Gable, paused. She pointed a manicured finger towards the base of the house, near the prize-winning bushes. "Oh, what's that interesting-looking shoot, Karen, dear?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet yards. "It looks almost like bamboo." From her window, Ilara could just see it. A single reddish-green stalk, no thicker than a pencil, pushing its way up through the pristine mulch. It was speckled and determined, a tiny spearhead of the coming invasion. Karen leaned down, a puzzled frown creasing her brow. "Oh, that's strange," she murmured, reaching out to touch it. "I have no idea what that could be." Ilara stepped. Back from the window, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. The bomb had been armed, the countdown had begun, and Karen had just lit the fuse herself. Karen, in her ignorance, did the worst possible thing. She pulled it. With a self-satisfied tug, she ripped the single stalk from the ground, tossing it aside into her compost bin. "Just a weed," she announced to the judges, who nodded, their attention already moving to her prize-winning peonies. Ilara, watching from her window, felt a shiver of grim satisfaction. Karen had just multiplied her problem. The act of pulling Japanese knotweed only serves to break up the rhizome, creating dozens of new opportunities for growth. She had taken a single soldier and created a battalion. The next 2 weeks were a study in exponential growth. First, 3 new shoots appeared where the original had been. Karen dispatched them with a hoe and a healthy dose of weed killer. A week later, a dozen shoots emerged, forming a small, defiant thicket. They were stronger this time, thicker, pushing aside the mulch with visible force. Karen's confident gardening posture began to show signs of strain. She spent an entire Saturday digging, turning over the soil around her azaleas, her face a mask of grim determination. Ilara continued her performance of quiet defeat. She tended to her recovering roses, which were showing the first signs of new leaf growth. She read on her porch, always with a book, always with a placid expression. When Karen, sweating and dirt-streaked, glared at her over the fence, Ilara would offer a small, sympathetic smile, a gesture that seemed to fuel Karen's fury more than any overt taunt could. The whispers started soon after. The Oakshade neighborhood was a hotbed of gossip, and the state of the 2-time champion's garden was a prime topic. The final judging for the Garden of the Year was only a month away, and Karen's pristine backyard was beginning to look besieged. The knotweed was relentless. It was now a dense grove nearly 2 feet tall, its broad, heart-shaped leaves choking out the delicate azaleas. It wasn't just in the flower bed anymore. Shoots were appearing in the middle of her perfect lawn, 20 feet from the original site. One morning, Ilara saw a new stalk pushing its way up through a crack in Karen's immaculate stone patio. Panic had officially set in. Karen's confident smirks were replaced by a haunted, frantic energy. Landscaping trucks became a common sight at her house. Experts came and went, shaking their heads, their voices low and serious. Ilara overheard snippets of their conversations. Highly invasive, extensive rhizome system, property disclosure laws. The cost of eradication was astronomical. It required repeated systemic herbicide injections, excavation, and sometimes even specialized root barriers buried deep in the ground. The price quoted by one company, overheard by Ilara during a particularly loud consultation on Karen's patio, was well into the 5 figures. Karen's social standing began to crumble along with her garden. Her afternoon teas stopped. Her friends, the same ones who had listened to her gloat about putting Ilara in her place, now spoke in hushed tones, their sympathetic glances barely concealing their schadenfreude. The neighborhood queen was being dethroned by a weed. The day of the final judging was a humid, overcast afternoon, the sky the color of slate. The 2 judges, Mrs. Gable and her companion, arrived looking somber. Karen met them at the gate, her face pale, her usual vibrant caftan replaced by a drab, shapeless dress. She looked haggard, defeated. She tried to steer them away from the backyard, focusing on her front lawn's flower beds. But the rules were clear. The entire property had to be assessed. With a deep, shuddering sigh, Karen led them to the back. The site was apocalyptic. The knotweed had completely taken over one corner of the yard. It was a dense, tropical-looking jungle, 4 feet tall, its bamboo-like stalks thick and menacing. It had swallowed the azaleas whole. The stone patio was visibly cracked, a jagged line running from the flower bed to the French doors of her house, with a determined green shoot emerging from the fissure. The once perfect lawn was pockmarked with rogue stalks. Mrs. Gable's face was a stony mask. She made a few sharp, decisive notes on her clipboard. "Karen," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth, "the bylaws of the competition are very clear regarding noxious and invasive species. This is a catastrophe." Karen didn't answer. She just stared at the monstrous green tide that was consuming her life's work, her pride, her identity. Ilara watched the entire scene unfold from her porch. She felt no joy, no thrill of victory, just a cold, hollow emptiness. She had unleashed a force of nature she couldn't control, a blight that would affect this property for years, maybe decades. The retribution felt disproportionate, monstrous, as The judges made their hasty retreat, their disapproval hanging in the air. Karen slowly turned her head. Her eyes, sunken and dark, found Ilara's. The hatred was still there, but it was now mingled with something new, a raw, desperate despair. That evening, as dusk settled, Ilara was startled by a frantic pounding on her front door. She opened it to find Karen, disheveled and wild-eyed, her hands stained with dirt. "You did this!" Karen hissed, her voice a ragged whisper. "This is your fault. I don't know how, but you did this." Ilara remained silent, her face a placid mask. "You have to help me," Karen begged, her voice cracking, the fury giving way to a pathetic plea. "It's getting into the foundation. The inspector said, he said it could damage the house. My house, Ilara." Ilara looked past Karen towards the property line. In the fading light, she saw it. A single, speckled, reddish-green shoot, thicker than a pencil, pushing its way up through the soil on her side of the fence. It had crossed the border. The monster she had unleashed was no longer just Karen's problem. It was at her own door. The sight of that single defiant shoot on her own property was like a bucket of ice water. The cold satisfaction Ilara had nurtured for weeks evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, sickening dread. The war was over, and there were no winners. Only two losers, standing on a shared battlefield, about to be consumed by their mutually assured destruction. "Get inside," Ilara said, her voice flat. She stepped back, holding the door open. Karen stumbled in, looking around Ilara's neat, orderly living room as if she were in a foreign country. The fight had gone out of her completely. She was just a terrified homeowner staring into a financial abyss. "They said I'll have to disclose it if I ever want to sell," Karen whispered, sinking onto Ilara's sofa without being invited. "They said it devalues the property by so much. We'll be ruined." The "we" hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged a shared fate. Ilara looked at the woman who had become her nemesis. The garish caftans, the smug superiority, the petty cruelties. It had all been a facade. Now, stripped of her garden and her social standing, Karen was just a woman, as vulnerable as the mangled roses in Ilara's yard. And Ilara, the quiet bookworm, had become a purveyor of botanical warfare, an architect of chaos who had failed. "To account for blowback, I know a specialist," Ilara said, the words tasting like ash. "I did some research." And so began the unholiest of alliances. The next day, a new kind of truck arrived, this one belonging to an invasive species eradication firm. The man who came to the door was grim and businesslike. He walked both properties, his boots crunching on the cracked patio stones, his diagnosis swift and brutal. The infestation was severe. The rhizome system had likely already spread extensively beneath both yards, a hidden, interconnected network of destruction. Eradication would be a multi-year process, involving repeated chemical injections, soil removal, and the installation of a deep underground barrier along the property line. The cost would be, as Ilara had overheard, ruinous. They agreed to split it. There was no other choice. The weeks that followed blurred into a grueling routine of shared misery. They stood, 6 feet apart, as men in hazmat suits drilled holes into their lawns and injected poison into the earth. They watched as a backhoe dug a deep, scarring trench along the property line, severing the root system, a physical manifestation of the divide they had created between them. The backyards that had been their respective sanctuaries, the sources of their pride and the stages for their war, were now toxic, barren wastelands. They rarely spoke. There was nothing to say. Apologies were pointless, and accusations were redundant. They were bound together not by forgiveness, but by a shared catastrophic consequence. They were partners in a bitter, expensive cleanup, the silence between them thick with the ghosts of flamingos, wind chimes, and roses. One sweltering afternoon, months into the treatment, they were sitting in their respective yards watching the chemical warning flags flutter in the breeze. Ilara was tending to her roses, which she had moved into large pots on her front porch, away from the poisoned earth. They were blooming again, small but resilient. Karen, looking thinner and older, spoke first, her voice quiet. "My husband wants to move. He says this neighborhood is cursed." "Are you going to?" Ilara asked, not looking up from her pruning. "We can't," Karen said with a hollow laugh. "Who would buy this house now? We're trapped." Ilara snipped a dead leaf from a stem. "We both are." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. "The wind chimes are gone," Ilara noted. "I took them down," Karen said. "I couldn't stand the noise anymore." The war had ended not with a bang, but with a slow, bankrupting whimper. Their lawns were gone, their savings were depleted, and their social lives were non-existent. The garden club had quietly replaced Karen as president. The neighborhood gossip had moved on to other, less depressing scandals. Years would pass. The knotweed would be beaten back but never truly gone. Every spring, they would both patrol the property line, their eyes peeled for the telltale reddish shoots, a shared ritual of vigilance. Their backyards would eventually recover, but they would never be the pristine showpieces they once were. The soil was tainted, and the memory of the invasion was too strong. They never became friends. The wounds were too deep, the cost too high. But the hatred had burned itself out, leaving behind a strange, exhausted understanding. They were two women who had pushed each other to the absolute limit, only to discover that the edge of the cliff was a shared one. One evening, Ilara was on her porch, reading a book, when she saw Karen struggling with a heavy bag of fertilizer. Without a word, Ilara put her book down, walked over, and helped her carry it to the garage. Karen nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Ilara replied, and that was it. They turned and walked back to their separate houses, to their separate lives, forever linked by the invisible, indestructible roots of the monster they had created together. The war was over. The karma had been delivered, not by a triumphant act of justice, but by the quiet, relentless growth of a single vengeful weed.